I live in the Yukon, just outside Whitehorse, about 40 minutes out between Whitehorse and Carcross, or actually Skagway, Alaska. And I think Alex mentioned microclimates, so my temperature is about 10 degrees cooler than Whitehorse. The daily highs are the same, the evening lows are much lower, and that's winter and summer. You can see that this is boreal forest. The forest here is full of lingonberries, so local cranberries, kinnikinnick, very few dandelions. I wish I had dandelions. Very few invasives. There's the odd Alsip clover and stuff like that. But with the right method, the right understanding of your environment, you can actually succeed. So, and I'll go through my journey in both talks between all those learnings I've had to get to where I'm at. So we do have big gardens, so you know that folks, they don't think we can garden in our climate. We use row covers. We get frost pretty much all summer long. So if we go 2 weeks without frost, we're lucky. And then temperatures above 40, evenings in summer, I think we get 3 or 4. So we have very cool mornings. Nope, fair enough. So like 0 to 5 Celsius is our typical morning low. But we grow lots of food and we do what we've got to do, and the bees do fine. I do use polystyrene hives, so here, Yukon, we actually have more moose than people in the Yukon. So the whole of Yukon, there's only about 40,000 people. So there's more black bears and more moose than people. The climate is fairly mixed. The temperature here, so this is Whitehorse, it follows the band that the interior has because we're on the cold side of the mountains. And then I'll show you that, for example, Dawson City is actually colder than Fairbanks. Same with, there's bookkeeping bees in Yellowknife, and there's a beekeeper up in Anchorage. So this is, I'm charts. I want facts, I want numbers, I don't want anecdotal. So this website is called WeatherSpark, and you can actually compare climates. A lot of the advice we get comes from the outside. Okay? It's not apples to apples. So one thing you need to understand is, understand your local environment. The methods, the approach are very close. But the when and how, sometimes it varies and it's different. Okay, so here what I did is, my climate's closer to Haines Junction, which is when you drive down the Alaska Highway, folks would know where that is. And you can see, it was just to compare Anchorage to Haines Junction, and then over here, Fairbanks to Dawson City. Okay, so, and there's a beekeeper in Dawson who gets, usually overwinters 4 to 8 colonies. He's a gold miner. He does it on his claim, and I'd say in general, he probably gets 90% success rate. So, but he has a system, he has an approach. And then over here, one thing that we need to understand too is our growing season. Okay, that's what I like this website. It does this, it does growing days, growing season, so it helps you visualize your beekeeping season. Okay, so I've done Anchorage, Fairbanks, Dawson, because the interior is actually hotter in the summer than the coastal areas or the mountainous areas. And folks don't realize that Dawson, you'll get up in the 80s, 85. Where I'm at, if I get 20 Celsius, so 70, I'm lucky. Okay, but the bees can do fine. So this is to give us context. We're speaking the same language. Okay? Where I keep bees, basically the same thing. So I usually have, I've got 3 bee yards, and I've got them set up with pallets. Usually I put black geotex around it. Why? Because I'm creating a microclimate. I want them to warm up and be warmer than the outside. Okay, why? Because once the bee is warmed up, she can fly off and do things. But if she can't warm up, the yard doesn't warm up fast enough, the bees can't go do anything. The other thing is, it'll melt a lot of the snow here a lot faster. I will like sprinkle wood ash. The wood ash, yes, it's to melt the snow as fast as possible. We do get a lot of wind, so if I'm looking this way, it's mountains. It's that view from that first picture. So it's mountains, and we get the wind coming off the mountains. So this helps with wind. It also helps with the bears and the grizzlies. Why? Because the electric fence here, and I have pictures of a black bear pooing right here. Walking around, we had a sow, a grizzly, and a couple cubs hanging around the yard, but not even touching it. Why? Because they don't have a taste of it. So if you start beekeeping and there's bears around, start with an electric fence. Don't even think you can get away without it. Because once the bear gets a flavor of it, you're done. Then it's a dead bear. Okay, so there's like 6 or 7 sows, grizzly sows in the area. Sometimes we have up to 14 cubs. When the boar comes down the hill, the mountain, scares all the females away, then you got this big monster boar. But they never bother my bees. Okay, so you don't have to worry about bees or bears if you do your thing. I use a lot of mutts. I do bring nooks in from British Columbia. They're mostly carnies, and typically I get most of my colonies through winter, and usually I know why I didn't get it through, and it's usually because it was an experiment, or I knew it was like, oh, let's see if it'll make it through. And then when you question, but I go into winter knowing my bees will get through. Okay, so you can get to the point where your level of confidence is, yeah, my bees are going to get through. So these are typical clusters coming out of winter. Okay? So I've had boxes like with 18 frames, like a double with 18 frames of bees coming out of winter. Okay? My colonies, I've overwintered 5-frame nooks. Okay, so I'm giving you context here. So I'm a bit warmer than Fairbanks, but much colder than Anchorage. Okay? 8 months of winter, and the bees can do this under the right conditions, if you prep them properly. Okay, and I'll go through some of the rules that I follow and things that I do to make sure that those bees can make it. So I'm an engineer. I have like 50 sensors. I'm measuring CO2, oxygen levels. I've got a microscope. I've analyzed about 15 Alaska honeys, 40 or 50 Yukon honeys, other honeys across Canada to figure out what's in our honey and what's good and bad about it. What are the sugar ratios? What does honey do? All that type of stuff. Why? I just love learning. My wife says I'm a freak, but I won't change. So when you are checking your colonies, I wish I could take notes. What I do is I take a lot of pictures, and those are my notes. Okay, if I see something fishy, I see something weird, I take pictures, and then I'll do a Facebook post. And those are my notes. Okay, so that's how I keep things up, is I share my failures and my successes. So you want to be a beekeeper? Initially I thought folks were like, you can't keep bees up in the Yukon. And then I started beekeeping in northwestern Ontario, so north of Lake Superior, at a gold mine there. I was a young engineer, and geologist friend said, Etienne, do you want to keep bees? I just convinced the environment department to buy 4 hives. I don't know what I'm doing, and I didn't know what I was doing, so we bought Beekeeping for Dummies, and that was her dream. And that was 20 years ago, and it's been fun. So one thing you need to do is, especially if you're new, be observant. Take a walk, understand your cycles. Okay, so your first bloom, is it typically late March, sometime in April? Is it in May? What does a spring look like? So I remember the one time, 2 years ago, we had snow till June, and first pollen was in June. It was horrible. Typically it's late April, early May, so sometimes you have to deal with these extremes up here. So you need to know your cycle. I had a wonderful dog for 17 years, and we took walks every day, probably 3 walks a day. I had my iPhone, I'd see a bee on a flower, like sow bears. Oh, wow, bees are on sow bears. And it's like in I'd say that's in April. It's not much, it's more resinous, but the bees go for it. Take a picture. So I did that for 4 or 5 years, took pictures and walked and observed. So now in my mind, I know my cycles. We've got willows up here that'll start blooming late April, all the way to early July. Because a lot of times the soil freezes 10, 15 feet, and as it thaws, the sunny side blooms first, and as the season goes, the cold side blooms later in the season. Okay? So a lot of times my honey is high in willow pollen and nectar, and you can taste it. Mixed in with some lingonberry. Ooh, very good honey. Okay, so know your cycle, take your dog walks, but be observant. Because it'll help, once you know your cycle, nutrition is key for us out there. If you don't know nutrition, you're going to fail. Sugar syrup is good. It's a filler and you need to use it, but it's not an end-all. Okay, I'll talk about pollen patties. Those are good, but you need to stop at some point. Why? Because you want winter bees. Because if you don't stop, they're going to keep doing brood. As long as there's brood in that colony, you will not have winter bees. Okay? Honey in the brood box. For me, I never touch it. And I'll show you how I make sure the honey in that brood box is actually June honey. Why? Because June honey is beautiful. It's cleaner honey. It's got really nice ratios in it. Less chance of it being honeydew honey. And with my setup, like that nook, I went to winter with 15 pounds, and there was still 5 pounds of honey in there. A single colony with 50 pounds or 60 pounds of honey going in, I'll consume maybe 25 to 30 pounds for 8 months, and a double consumes maybe 40 pounds. So bees can make it up here very easily, but it's understanding. The more honey they consume, the more you'll have moisture issues. Okay, the more you vent, the more heat you're venting out, the more you'll have moisture issues. I'm not saying don't do top vent, but don't shim it like they do down south, because you're going to kill your bees. Okay, so there's things you need to do. So your first spring. So like I said, I'm going to share this with you. So this is Yukon timing, so it's probably like Toke, Fairbanks, it aligns more with there. But it's pretty damn close. You can shift it over depending on your start. And this one here is managing a new package, a nook, from the start. So literally you gotta buy them early, but as you go through, you can see there's all these steps. So in my second talk, we're gonna talk about why you would do some of these things. Okay? And understanding why you do something is critical. So critical thinking for a beekeeper, if you fail, no problem, I failed. But it's asking questions, collecting the facts, and trying to understand what's going on. And the thing I like about these groups is this is a network. The sooner you realize that you can share your failures and not feel stupid, the better you'll be. Because group knowledge is great. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of these things as we go through the talk. And the last slide is managing an overwintered hive, because it changes at that point. And beekeeping becomes more real once you've overwintered that colony, because now you have to deal with swarming and different things. So I do a lot of looking, observing. Okay, so this last summer, I was home maybe 3 weeks the whole summer. I was at work, I was traveling, I was gone all of August, I was stuck in Africa doing stuff. And so I couldn't do what I usually do. But with 4 inspections, I got more honey than I ever had. My bees went to bed for winter decently. But you can see that once you understand your key points in your season, there's a lot of things you can not worry about, because you understand the what if or if then type scenarios. So this here is a book. If you Google it, you can find it online, because you can tell so much by just looking at that colony. The sounds, the smells, the level of activity, and the more you do it, the more you're like, huh, wow. So it's a book from, I think, the 50s. It was a German book, but it's damn good. It's super easy read. And what it does, it helps you understand what you're seeing throughout the season. My typical inspection is about 5 minutes. I do one big inspection in the spring and one big one usually in August, early August, after I pull my honey. This is where I'm strategic. So I have a Sharpie, I'll write, is it brood, is it honey, is it pollen, on top of the frames as I'm doing my inspections. Week 1, I'll do an inspection this way, and I'll do the 3-4 frames until I hit the brood. And then about a week later, or 2 weeks later, I'll do an inspection this way. I like singles. Why? Because there's only one box. Okay, and then honey management is much easier. Okay, and I think I talk about my singles approach towards the end. But literally is, when you open that box, if you don't know why you're opening up the box, don't open up the box. You don't need to. Are you looking for eggs? Are you looking for larvae? Are you looking for capped brood? I'd say don't even look for the queen. So you're looking for where it's at in the life cycle, population cycle. How many frames are brewed? Because you can start doing math to say this is how many bees will be produced in a week, 2 weeks. When was first pollen? And it triggers all these things throughout the season. So let's see, the next one is the debris boards. I was super happy that Alex spoke about this, because for me, this is a lot of my inspection. Is about 24 hours before my inspection, I'll go in there, I'll clean up the board, I'll put it back in, and I'll know what they're doing. Okay? Oh, I've got chalk brood. Or if I do a treatment, in the mackerel, I've got a lot of mites. Okay? So that debris board is wonderful. The other thing you see sometimes is colors, pollen colors. And then once I know the pollen color, I've done microscopy on them, so I know where plants are coming from, but I have an idea of what's coming in the colony. Okay? And there's a lot you can tell from here, but you just have to start looking at it. The brown cappings that she mentioned is hatching brood, or hatching bees. The light colored wax is their building wax. They're expanding the frames. So you can see them expanding the colony, hatching out, front and back, and the efficacy of your treatments. Okay, so I do OEV, oxalic acid, early in the season. I've started doing it before I put my pollen patty, before I start brood rearing. Why? Because I've noticed that if I treat after I start, I have to treat like 4 or 5 times to get a lot of impact, because the mites go straight into that cell once the queen starts laying, and they disappear. You can't really do anything with them once it's capped, especially if you're using OE. Okay? A lot of times there's still snow on the ground, but it is what it is. If I want honey, if I want swarms, I love swarms. Why? Because it means that I can do splits. Okay? I had trouble doing splits in the past. Why? Because I didn't understand the nutrition cycle and how the population expands and grows over the season. So I typically put a pollen patty with about 2 pounds, and I use the stuff that has probably 15% real pollen in there. I put it usually 3rd week or last week of March. Okay, that colony instantly starts brood rearing. Within 2 hours, the temperature in there spikes up where the nest is to about 95 degrees F, so 35 C. And so now in my mind is, I know the queen is in there, because a colony that doesn't spike up tells me they have a queen issue. So I can plan for it. Understand that if there was a bunch of healthy winter bees in there, that colony without a queen is not doomed, because they're winter bees. Okay, so if you do it properly, they can live 300 days. Okay, it's when they become nurse bees that their clock starts ticking down. Okay, because they'll become foragers and then they'll die. Their lifespan will shrink. So I've held a colony without a queen till June. mid-June before I had a queen to put her in there, and it recovered. I shrunk it down into a smaller volume. Sometimes if it was a healthy queen death, I could take these frames to boost another colony. So you can make a decision. So assessing your queen early in the season is critical. Okay, so when I put that pollen patty in early April, late March, do the math, so 21 days. So I'm crossing my fingers that I have a warm spell so I can do an inspection probably at the 25 to 28 day mark. So late April. Why? Because at that point I should be able to see the pattern. Okay, there'll be hatching bees, a lot of young bees, but then I'll see some mixed brood. I'll see some eggs, some larvae, and I'll see the ratio and how many frames are in there. And then it gives me an idea of how the queen is doing. So for me, that is pretty much the first assessment. See how it says looking for 6 frames. So that's actually, right now the way I do it, it's actually 21 days to 28 days after adding the pollen patty. Because typically I'm still getting -15 to -30s, and I can't really open the box up, but I can put the pollen patty in there. I get warm weather and I can assess the queen. Is it expanding? Okay, or is it shrinking, or is it steady state? And what you want to do is, spring is critical for us. If the bees aren't growing in numbers, that colony is not going anywhere. Okay, so if you had, say, 5 frames of bees in a single, you're hoping for 7 frames 2-3 weeks later. You're hoping for 10 frames a month and a half later. If you're not seeing that, you got to make a call. Okay, there's an issue with your queen. A lot of our issue is we wait. We want all the answers, and you'll never get it. Okay, so I've learned to recognize, usually I can spot this one with one little $30 temperature sensor. This one here I can spot pretty damn quick. Just first observation, I count the number of frames of bees, how many frames of brood, and the pattern, and you can tell. I've had colonies come out in May where it was actually a double, and it was spilling bees in May. And I'm like, wow, I gotta do splits. That was a mistake, because then it dropped to -30 and they struggled. Even with, because the queens I got were from California, and they were okay, but they weren't being accepted, and there's all these issues. But early splits, I don't do my splits now until end of May, in June, because the environment is more, I guess, kind to the bees and they're less stressed. When you're not really foraging on food out there, if there's nothing in the environment, don't do splits, because you're gonna fail, because the bees aren't ready for it. You can do it, but it's risky. So you can see how I'm measuring growth. So if there's a steady growth, your queen's good. If it's the same or less, you got to find a queen or use those bees to boost up a weaker colony. That is actually expanding, and it's better to put your numbers together and get a strong colony early in the season than to try to maintain 2 struggling colonies. Okay, because sometimes it's just a lack of numbers. And for myself, getting a queen is $90. Okay, so that's Canadian, so it's $75 US, but it's expensive. And chances are early queens are coming from California, Hawaii, and stuff like that. And it's hit and miss for me when I use those. So the queens I want are the ones in June that are coming from Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. Why? Because they're local mated queens and they just seem to do better. So feeding, last year, coming out of winter, I had a colony with a single deep and a medium. The medium still had 6 frames of honey capped. This was in May. And the bottom box still had 4.5 frames of honey capped. okay? So it was full, so I didn't have to feed. So I rarely feed. The only time I feed is to help the bees cleanse their system and basically kickstart brood rearing. Does it make a difference? And this again, it's like I've done it, but then there's issues with cold, hot, syrup goes sour, and then my bees have gut issues. So I tend to not feed in the spring because it causes me more headaches. I'll do pollen patties, and I only technically feed about 22 pounds worth of sugar max per colony. So if, imagine that in a ratio of 2 to 1. That's all the feeding I do in season. Okay? I usually get 40 to 50 pounds per honey per colony on the hives that I'm focusing on. But you can see that up here, even in boreal forest, if you keep the honey that they produce in there, usually that box is 100 pounds by mid-June. Okay, so they've got all the honey they need for the season now. So now I focus on honey. So eventually you do go late spring. These are strategies if you do have a new colony. It's different between a new colony and an overwintered colony. If your box is full of honey coming out of winter, you're good. You don't really need to feed. You might have to stimulate sometimes and kick things up, but you don't really have to. I use pollen patties because, again, boreal forest, if I put more than 4 colonies in one yard, I get no honey. Why? Because they're competing, there's not enough in the environment for more than 4 colonies. If I do 2 colonies that are producing, and then some smaller colonies, then I get my 50 to 60 pounds. Okay, so the more you do it, the more you observe, you'll see that your environment has limited resources, and you need to understand what that is. And then eventually I get to late summer. I'll start with 1-to-1 to get the feeding going, and then I'll switch to 2-to-1. And literally, and then I get into bulk feeding, and usually they're ready by the end of August. And then I might just do a bit of trickle feeding, just to maintain. Okay, so sometimes we get dearths, and that 1 week of really hot weather I get in the Yukon, where it goes up to like 25 C, like 75 to 80, but dry, and then the RH drops to like 5% and we're at risk of forest fires, is sometimes I'll see signs of EFB, stressors. Because the pollen coming in probably is not as nutritious, there's a lack of water, there's all these things. So I may actually pop a pollen patty on there with a 1-to-1 feed, and usually all the symptoms I see, they go away. So when we're stressed, we can be compromised and we're more prone to disease. So understanding the stressors our bees go through helps you reduce disease and, I guess, pests, insects, and stuff like that. So first, summer, let's see, nutrition we talked about. You can see this was collected in both yards. Okay, so this was my up yard and this was my home yard. So do you know what fireweed is? Answer there. So this is fireweed pollen. And you can see here there's a mix of brassicas, a mix of probably dandelion. There's some dark red ones in there, and I thought that was pollen, but it's actually rust spores. Okay, so it's like, huh. And sometimes these rust spores outnumber the other stuff. So now I've learned that another reason I do pollen patties late July, August is to reduce the amount of pollen spores that they bring. Why? Because there's nothing else in the environment, so the bees are desperate. They'll collect stuff off of it. Okay, and then in the winter when I'm testing the bee guts, all I see is rust spores. So this year I have a lot of rust spores because I didn't follow my rules because I wasn't there. I didn't do pollen patties in August. It was late. Nutrition is critical. One type of pollen, so I know folks that do fireweed in the Yukon and Watson Lake, they struggle with overwintering. Okay? And chances are it's because it's a monoculture. It's a single diet is an issue. So if you are collecting, you do want to see multicolors. Okay? Okay, there's a lot of research out there that shows that polyfloral pollens, like a mix of pollens, gives them that well-balanced diet. This one here is, do you know when your nectar flows are? When I first started beekeeping in the Yukon, they said the nectar flow is in mid-July. I said, okay. And then once I started having swarming issues and my technique got me to a point where my bees were ready to go in May, mid-May, I soon discovered that the best nectar flow is in June, early June to mid-June. And that's the lingonberries, it's all the native flowers. Beautiful, beautiful honey. There's a lot of willow nectar in there, so it's a nice marketable honey. And the later in the season you go, it gets into more fireweed, more of the clovers, and more of the non-habitats. So this was me taking my dog walks, and then over time, like I said, I'm an engineer, so I have an Excel, and I created my own calendar. Okay, so these are all the flowers, the main ones, the color of the pollen ball, and then basically where the nectar flow is. And now with healthy bees, I know I can start building honey from late May to the end of July. And I just pull my honey supers at the end of July, regardless. Why? Because if I keep them on, I get a lot more honeydew. Okay, and for me, honeydew is a gut irritant for the bees, and it causes a lot of poop and gut issues. Okay, so I've learned to manage that. So yes, I pulled my honey supers early last summer, but the challenge is I didn't do pollen patties, and my feeding in August, I didn't really do it. So they brought in a lot of honey. Okay, so now I'm noticing honeydew issues in my colony. Some of them have no sebum, but others you can just see it's issues. And if I squish the bee guts and I look at it, it's full of honeydew elements, stuff that isn't honeydew honey or rust spores and stuff like that. So anyways, lots of info, but it's just to show you how everything's connected. So my season management is late April, clean up, queen assess, ensure honey frames are moved to the outside positions. Okay, so I'm moving my honey to the outside. I do use follow boards on smaller colonies to shrink them down. I've got some poly 5-frame and 6-frame nuts that I use, but I'm preparing for winter in spring. Okay, I want really, if I've got leftover heavy honey frames, I'll make sure that that bottom brood box, because eventually I'll have to double up. When you're doing singles, you still have to add boxes on top. But what I want to do is I'm putting heavy honey frames on the outside. It's good for insulation, thermal lag, and all that type of stuff, thermal mass, so it's good for the bees. And the bees won't really consume it. It's already drawn out and capped out with honey, so it's good, especially if it's nice clear honey. And then I'm building frames up, because bees always like the top box more, especially in cold climates. Like I said, I preempted this, so I tend to move cap brood to the top box because it does better, and then honey frames to the outside and to the lower box if I'm doing singles or doubles. Late July, I'll check the brood nests, general health check. So this is big inspection, and literally I'll add pollen patties. I've pulled the honey already, and it's time to go. So the reason I like beekeeping in Yukon is it's 2 months, 2 to 3 months. Yes, I've got these things, but now I've built it in so that my actual management is not that much once you know your cues. And like I said, weekly I'll walk to the yard, I'll smell around, I'll look around. I might open 1 or 2 of the colonies just to have a look, and I'll mark what's going on. In a perfect world, I'll do it every, say, 10 days. Last summer it was just too busy, I did it not enough. But the bees actually enjoyed me better because they gave me more. Okay, so there is a thing with humans. Typically, I'll do most of my OV early in spring. So I've treated oxalic acid before. I used to do it after the pollen patty because I couldn't get access. Now I bought one of those Insta-Vapes, so I can just do it at the front entrance because I am using polys, and that one in a poly, it'll melt it, and I had this plywood thing that I made so I could put the wand underneath, but I could only do it in the back, but I thought myself a wall, so I have all these excuses why I couldn't do it. So now with an Instabate with a little adapter for the knob, I can stick it in there, and I do a treatment before I put the ball back. Why? Because at that point is, yeah, there might be a micro nest in there, but most of the mites are exposed. Okay, so once those mites are behind cappings, OAV is useless. Okay, and you need to understand that it's only 95% effective for the exposed mites. And if 75% of the mites are below cappings, how effective is that? Okay, because I used to do my first treatment a month after I did my pollen bags. So sometimes I get like 4 or 5 mites drop, and I'm like, woo! And then I said, oh, let's check this out. A week later, I do it again, I get 75 mites on the same colony. Okay, so then it made me question about OAV and the potential. I've also experimented where I didn't treat a colony. And it takes about 3 years for that thing to get to a point where there's millions, I won't say millions, I'm exaggerating there, but if you did the treatment, there'd be thousands of mite drops on that bottom board. And that colony collapses during summer. You have PMS, so basically it's all diseases, the stressors from the mites. Your brood looks like EFB, it's all mushy and stuff, spotty brood, and it collapses, and the bees hate you and try to stay because they say you didn't take care of it. Okay, but usually I can get away with now with 1 or 2 treatments in the spring, and I'm good. And the challenge is if you're treating in August, it's too late, because that's when our winter bees are being produced. Okay, you need to learn to deal with mites before winter, because if there's too many mites in August, your winter bees will be compromised, because they're the ones being parasitized. I guess with the mites are actually feeding on them, and then they're hatching out, and they're your winter bees. So they've been infected and impacted by those mites, stressed out by those mites. So up here, we're actually quite lucky. Okay, so there are ways to deal with mites. Because down south they have brood almost, and I mean in the lower 48, well, most places have brood almost the whole year. So those mites are being produced constantly. They don't rely on winter bees like we do out here. We need winter bees to survive. We need our bees to survive 200 to 250 days. So that in the spring, they have all that good fat body in there that they use to promote or to give immunity to the new generation. But if they don't have those fat bodies, they can't do that. So it compromises the next generation, the first generation. And usually that's why in spring you get that rapid decline. More bees dying than are being brought up. So usually late May, early June, I'm preparing my splits. And this is where I like stimulating swarming. I'll take the old queen, put her in a box with a few frames of brood, honey, nook, bring it to my second yard. I'll do the same thing there, bring it to my first yard. So I'm just simulating swarming. And then what I'll do is I'll buy some queens. I've tried raising my own queens, but it's hit and miss. And sometimes I use, let's just say it loses traits that you really liked. So I had one, she was awesome, she lived 5 years, she produced so many bees, she was great at building wax, but she's like, after I got to, like, well, once I added a honey super, she said, no, I'm stopping here. So they weren't good at doing surplus honey. And I love honey. Okay, so eventually I just used her as a brood producer. So sometimes when you are trying to raise your own queen, you'll succeed, but recognize the traits you're looking for. There's the mite resistance, there's honey producers, overwintering. I'd say those are generally the ones we look for. And sometimes when you do your own, you'll lose some of those traits. Okay, but you can recognize it, and sometimes that's not your objective. Sometimes you might have 1 or 2 colonies in your yard, like a resource colony. That the purpose of that colony is to make bees and make wax. Not make honey, because you're going to take those resources and put it in your production colonies. And usually by August, Sometimes I do use Hive Alive. Does it work? There's all these things, and I try them out. And I guess in theory, and from what I've observed, it seems to work. But if it's infected with some things, I think it might be able to hold a certain level. But if your frames are infected with feces from the previous years with no sealant on it and all these things, Hive Alive won't save you. It may help stabilize things, but if there's severe infection in there, it's not going to cure things. Okay? It may be able to maintain. Same with those blue towel things and all that. It's not a main treatment. It's a maintainer. So if you have a high level, you'll get a higher level. But if you have a low level and you use some of these treatments, it may maintain, but it's not going to stop. And then usually my last feed is early September. And this year the problem was that it was cold. And so I couldn't actually reduce the volumes of my colony. Because imagine, I was gone August. I was home a week in July, because my wife wanted to go to Lake Bay kayak for 2 weeks. So I was like, shoot. Okay, but you do what you gotta do. But the bees are in a decent shape. They're in a bigger volume than I usually like. But I'm leaving on a trip in May, or actually April, May, when I'm doing this stuff. But now all my colonies have extra volume. So I guess it happened for a reason. So again, understanding your diseases, your pollen cycle, you'll see there's a lot of the diseases we deal with. There is a relationship to nutrition. Okay, I borrowed this from Randy Oliver, and I made my own based on what I see here. And these are the things you can learn to do as you go along. So when I first started beekeeping, I couldn't get my bees to swarm and I couldn't get any honey. So the first 3 years, I was like, I want honey. And I had one frame of honey that I stole from the brood box. Why? Because I wanted some honey. And it was beautiful honey, but I didn't know why. Then I started reading up on nutrition and population dynamics and understanding that, if I do early March or mid-March pollen patties, then I started monitoring temperatures in my colony. So I started with one sensor per box, and then I migrated to I had 15 sensors per box, and then I had a colony with 32 sensors. Why? Because I wanted to know where that cluster goes. Like I said, I'm a bee geek. Okay? So I used a lot of my engineering background to understand what is happening in that box in the winter. What are the bees doing? Are they clustered, not clustered? And I'm telling you right now, so minus 15 is like 0F. That's where my bees actually start clustering. And it's a light cluster. Okay? They might be clustered underneath a bit, but the top of that box, they're using those sidewalls and that super insulation top, because I do R40 on top, way better than what the cluster can do themselves. Okay, R40, bees can't do that. Bees can do maybe R8, so equivalent to maybe a poly wall. So the reason I can get through a winter with 30 pounds is that for 8 months. Okay, so we'll talk about that. So you can see how I do early pollen patties. And I do basically August pollen patties. Why? Is because if I don't, the temperature starts dropping early August. And then I want to preempt these spikes. So if I put pollen patties here, it stays flat till I stop feeding pollen patties. That temperature here, that's the brood nest temperature. I want to keep it above 35C or 95F. That tells me that the queen is still laying, they're still making brood. So by me adding pollen patties here, it keeps it flat. It means that my winter bees are being produced in August, late August, versus in July. So instead of my bees being 300 days old, they're 200 days old. Okay? But the key is you need to stop. Okay, folks down south, they don't understand this. And I tell them, I said, if my bees can go from September, stuck in a box, till May, there's no reason your bees can't do it down there. No, hardly any planting plates. Okay? So the key is you stop,
and then the bees go into a dearth. The dearth triggers them to start accumulating fat bodies on their bodies for the newer bees, okay, as they're being raised. They need a dearth to produce winter bees. Okay, so in desert areas, there's summer hot dearth. They have long-lived bees during that hot period. Why? Because there's no other food. So the bees go into a conservation mode, and they wait for the temperature to change for them to start brooding. Okay, so that's the winter bee dynamics. They need food, good food, but also at some point they need to stop getting fresh food. And it's the stopping of fresh food. You can still do syrup, but additives sometimes, like even I had that fondant with Hive Alive in it. I like it, but what it did is it stimulated the bees to continue brooding longer than I wanted. It went into August or in October, too long. Okay, so we got to stop feeding them at some point. So lots of info. I create my slides less for presenting, more for a future reference group. So it's like a guide. Okay, so it's less about reading the slide, it's more about talking to the slide. And if you do have a pollen collector, don't collect it, like if you're doing it out of curiosity, you want to see what the mix of colors are throughout your season. It'll help you understand your pollen mix. Okay. Small cluster size going into winter, like rust spores. Here, I have evidence I'm taking it. I was coming out of the house, we had like -10, I think it was in August, so my whole fiery patch died. And then it got warm again, and that fiery patch was just humming with bees. I was like, what's going on? So then I went and I could see the bees flying off with orange pollen balls on their legs. And I'm like, So then I went to the hive, and on the debris tray, there's a bunch of these orange pollen balls. I grabbed a couple of those, put them underneath the microscope, and then this is what I discovered. So it's not pollen. So these are types of rust spores. It's like a winter fungal spore. These are rust spores, fireweed ones. So this is this one, and this is the fireweed. And then this is the poop during the season. You got nosema, you've got these indicators, the fried eggs. So I'm like, Then I analyzed my honey, and I was like, wow, I'm seeing the same stuff. I'm seeing poop everywhere. And then I start reading up that they have a hard time digesting that. And it just goes right through their system, and it builds up in their hind end. And eventually they can't hold it in anymore, and then they poop inside the hive. Oh, wow, I'm sick with nosema. I've just pooped in the hive. They want to keep it clean. The next bees cleans it up, gets infected, and that's how the cycle works. Okay, so it does happen, but I'm not saying you need to buy a microscope, but there's a couple people here that do have microscopes, and there's ways of understanding this. Okay, so again, information share. So honey, a lot of times I see folks overwinter, especially beginner beekeepers, because the season wasn't long enough, they didn't draw out enough wax frames and honey frames, and then they overwinter with a bunch of empty frames on the side. Okay, so I say stop. Pull them out, put these follower birds there, because there's no point having empty frames in a box over winter. It's creating open space, there's no thermal mass in it, you're gonna stress your bees out. That's where your condensation's gonna happen, that's where the dew point happens. Okay, so take them out. It's better, I'm telling you right now, you can overwinter if I for a nook in the right way. You can do the singles. Okay, so all those things they say you need to put a medium, and you need to do double, triple. Yes. You can do it under the right conditions if you understand how to set them up. Okay? Because the first time I did a singles in the Yukon, I was like, whoa. And then they came out beautiful. I was like, wow. Okay, then with all my numbers and everything, I'm like, yeah, it's very possible. And when I got that first 5 for a nook through the winter, I was like, holy mackerel, this is a game changer. Why? Because now I have a queen in a small colony that I can use to either boost a new colony, or make a new colony, or help a failing queen recover. So all my older queens, I overwinter in a nook. So when I pull those nooks, then I use them for my resource colonies. Because pinching a $90 queen, even though she might be 3 years old, she's still laying, still producing stuff, I keep her. If the bees are aggressive or defensive, she's not really laying, or it's a drone layer, she's gotta go. Okay, but if she's still doing worker brood, I keep her. So there is a reason why there's honey around a frame like that. That's pure thermodynamics. You got your brood here, heat rises. This is a thermal catch. It's on purpose. Yes, it gives the bees access to that honey, but it's also to keep that frame warm. Heat rises. This little pinch point where you get your honey frame sticking out, it's just a couple bees wide. So all it takes is like 2-3 bees to block that space up, times the 18 inches across, and the bees can actually slow that heat from going out. And then it gets captured in nice thick honey frames. I think it's the next one, but literally, and usually the bees like keeping an open channel on the outside. And people say, how do you know that? Because I observed it and I measured it, and I took pictures of it. Okay, so you need honey for thermal mass and you need it for food. So literally, I created this, this is the winter dynamics. So you got a cluster, that's your heat source. On top here, you have pretty much infinite insulation in a tree. Okay? You've got a bit less insulation on the sidewalls, depending on where you're at. We won't get any feral colonies in Yukon, it's just too cold. And our trees are too small. Then you got your frames with honey, so basically stuff sticks here. Typically single entrance out the bottom. The cavity is about a single deep. Condensation usually builds in the bottom. And then CO2 vents out the front. Okay? So, and I'm telling you right now, bees can manage CO2, can manage water on their own. Our bees need more moisture, even like today, right now, there's only about 20% of the water they need in the air. Okay? Because folks forget that RH is temperature related. So if you heat that outside air to, say, 70 or 80 F, RH drops. Okay, so the bees need water. Overventilation, I'm not saying don't ventilate. Overventilation vents all that heat and all the excess moisture out. So now the bees have to eat more to produce more moisture for them to actually stay at healthy levels. Okay? So I've got it somewhere, but literally there's two dynamics. There's the bees in a wooden box that do cluster, and they spend most of the winter in a cluster. And so the bees are protecting themselves. Okay, the bees is the protection. Versus the box. So I've done relationships with the heat loss on the sidewalls and temperatures over winter and compared inside and outside and got the correlation and all that type of stuff. And it's a beautiful relationship. This here, the key is once this box has brood, the bees they convert to enclosure driven. So now they're trying to keep a box warm with no insulation. So consumption of honey, usually in the spring, has to do with heat. They need heat to maintain the brood nest. Up here, we all insulate. I'd say don't take your insulation off till May to June. If you're using wooden boxes, I couldn't have honey if I didn't use poly boxes. Why? Because they'd be using all the excess honey to just keep the nest warm. Okay, so there's folks in the Yukon that done non-scientific trials, but they did a control where wooden colonies, so 4 or 5 wooden colonies, 4 or 5 poly colonies, or with their sleeve, the insulated sleeve on top, and it was about 30%. Okay, the guy's 90 years old, and he took the time to do that, and he's like, wow. So now he keeps it insulated year-round. Why? Because he quickly realized that with the cold mornings, even in the summer, basically the bees cluster. So it means there's daily clustering even in summer in Yukon, so we need to insulate. Okay, so that in a nutshell is no insulation versus insulated. And that's the nutshell there. I'd say your climate here is similar to, I'd say, central Canada. And you can get away with boxes. If your evenings, if you have them over 60 degrees and your evenings are not that cold, that morning low, I'd say you don't really need to worry about insulating in the summer. But if you do get drops close to, like in the mid to high 30s, consider insulation, and chances are you'll get better honey crops. And your bees will be less stressed. Because one of the stressors we have is cold stress, even in the summer. So you can see I've got lots of numbers. And this is just, I'm not here to convince people to do either or. It's just to show you the facts and the numbers. So you can think about your context and say how it applies. So you can see here, these were the ambient temperatures. So we did get a bunch of minus 40s, which is the same, this is Celsius, but minus 40 Fahrenheit and Celsius is the same thing. So this is around 0 F here. I think it's minus 15 Celsius. You can see that's our average that winter. In the box, the average temperature, see, it makes sense, it's around 16 degrees. And then inside the cluster, or inside the warm spot, is around 25 C, so around 70 F. And beautiful. Nice, tight distributions, and that's what you're looking for. So I did this last night. So I did use slatted racks. So if you use slatted racks, I'd say if you're in Fairbanks, colder areas, be careful, you need to pull it out in spring, because because again, the ground freezes 15 feet. So what it creates a cold envelope below the cluster that doesn't really warm up, and the bees won't cleanse. Okay? If you've got decent warm temperatures, your stand is decent, high, and it's warm underneath, the bees will be okay. I do love slat racks, but what I do now is I have an open screen bottom board in a crawl space, so there's no direct wind. It gets covered in snow, and this is the key point here. We need winter. The problem is our winters are shitty now. Because we get cold, we get warm, we get cold, we get warm. And what it does is it activates the bees. It messes with their system. So this year I'm trialing with an insulated bottom board, and I hate it. Why? Because the bees aren't staying chilled. Like I had minus 40 the one day, and then it got up to 5, so like 40 F the next day. And I'm like, frig. And then I can see the stress going on inside because the bees are trying to adjust to the new temperatures. So, but in the past, this curve, so by having an open screen bottom board, it shifts it over this way. Okay, so it keeps them chilled. So again, when I start putting that pollen patty on, I'm going to put the tray. I'm going to block it off. Why? Because now it's enclosure driven. I want to keep those bees, even though those temperatures is open screen bottom board. So like, if I go back here, this is all open screen bottom. Okay, so you can see I think we had minus 52 was the coldest, and we had like minus 48 for about, like below minus 40 for about a week. And the coldest it got underneath that colony in the crawl space was minus 15. And the temperature just below the cluster was like minus 5. And then if you look at this curve here, the metabolic curve, you can see I'd rather air on this side here, the cold side, than on this side, because there is an impact here where consumption goes up. Okay, so I want it here. So this is metabolic rate, so watts per kilogram. You can do the math. 10 watts is 1 pound of honey. Continuous in a week's time. Okay, so, and you can see 1 pound of honey is almost just over a cup of water that the bees need to do. So now do the math. So when I went to the expo this year, some of the folks there, they consume like 80 pounds. So that's 40 cups of water that their bees need to manage in 2 months, 3 months. Okay? Because they don't have winters.
Etienne, real quickly, would you go back through those temperatures in Fahrenheit when you're talking about below, underneath, yeah, because you got up into 5 below. I'm
Yeah.
pretty good at, yeah, anyway, so, yeah, 5 below in Celsius
So
is-
5 below in Celsius is like 5 Fahrenheit, I think. 5 to 10. So like 0 Fahrenheit is minus 15 Celsius. 32 we know is 0.
So right below the cluster, it was
Oh,
40 ounce, that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
So this is 32F. This is 40. This is just about 0 Fahrenheit.
Right, so even though the external temperature was, when you were talking about the temperature just below the cluster, the external temperature was
Minus 40.
minus
30.
40, and inside the hive with the insulation, it was about 5 degrees, 45 degrees
Yeah.
warmer than the external temperature underneath the cluster.
And that's the temperature that pretty much determines what level of metabolic rate they need to maintain to produce the heat they need to stay healthy. And that's why at minus 15 Celsius, so around 0 F, my bees don't really cluster because there's enough resting metabolism. Like right now, he's sitting there, he's producing probably a good 60 to 80 watts of energy just by sitting there. And it's going in the room, and then the ventilation needs to take care of it. So everybody together, we produce heat just sitting here. Bees do the same. But if it's a wooden box, all that heat is gone. If we put shins and Vivaldi boards and all these things, it's all gone. Okay? If you do top entrance, minimize the lower entrance. You still need one, but don't make it massive. And you can manage the throughput of the air that way. So I'll do a slide. I don't want to go too long. So again, lots of numbers. This is for you. And it's around slatted racks and non-slatted racks. And literally, MR here, this is metabolic temperature, and it's the range. And you can see it's the same as the previous one. It's this in a, whatchamacallit, a cluster. Okay. But, and then I put the curve here to show where it's at in the ratio. It's just numbers. But literally, in August, what I'm doing, late July, I'm determining what size of box I'm going to use to overwinter, depending on how many bees I have in that box. If you can't do this in September, it's too late. Because you need to give time for the bees to prep that nest, set up their channels, and all that type of stuff. So literally, I'm telling you, all these 3 volumes work up here. I do similar to what Tim does. I put sheets of styrofoam on top. One of them has a cutout, just the perfect size to put a pollen patty. I don't use candy boards or sugar, rice sugar in winter. Why? Because there's so much honey left in the spring. You can see follow boards, pollen patty. This is my crawl space. This is that thing I made where I can put a pollen patty. When there's no pollen patty in there, I've got a plug. Right now I've got a CO2 sensor and O2 sensor in there and temperature sensors. And then you can see the 5-ring nook. I squish it in between. I put Tyvek or the vapor barrier tape, a bunch of insulation on top. And I got it all cut now, so it's easy. So setting up a colony takes me 5 minutes. To open up a colony to add a pollen patty takes me 10 seconds. Pop, pop, pop. Put the pollen patty, close back up. And very little exposure to the plant. Okay, so this is what the fella up in Dawson uses, Dawson City. So again, top entrance, no problem with that. But when they're prepping the bottom, you can see it's reduced to the smallest size. And then right now it's taped while they're putting the wrapping, and then they'll use their knife to cut it open, and then it's a typical top entrance. And most of the beekeepers that don't do polys use this. They do a 4-pack, and it works wonderful. And on average, they'll get 75 to 80% through the winter. So, and the insulation, the side wall is about 10R, and the top, there's an extra pillow that they put in, so it's about R20 to R30 on top. And then I think this is my last slide, but you can see this is where the fun is. Once you get that colony through winter, you can consider boosting other colonies, making splits, making resources. You want swarming.
Yes.
Okay? But it's what you do with it. You need to recognize it and then you leverage it to make splits. Because the more you do splits, I like having 4 to 12 colonies. Okay? I like having maybe 1 or 2 nooks going into winter to help me if I do have losses. Okay, so the key is, I don't want to buy bees. I think last year I bought a couple of nooks, and it was like the first time in 6 years, 7 years, but I wanted new genetics. But usually 4 to 12, if I'm not working too much in summer, it'll be higher. If I'm working hard, I'll keep it at 4. And that's usually where I hover. And yeah, it's lots of fun. And I'd say me recognizing the signs in nature was probably the most important thing. Okay, noticing the patterns of the weather, of what's blooming, what the bees are bringing in, and then those non-obvious ones around, it'll be in the next one, but contaminated frames. And the issue I was having with Nosema and something I call amoeba disease has to do with me reusing old equipment without really understanding that that was probably the main contributor to my reoccurring Nosema issue. I was only losing 1 colony or 2 colonies in winter out of 10, but it was frustrating. Because I tried, they look healthy going in, but then they come out of winter with 14, 16 frame of bees, and within a month there'd be nothing left. And there was just a rapid growth. I'd open it up, I can see the queen, I can see some eggs, I can see some larvae, but I couldn't see anything past that. Okay, so I'll talk about that one later. But, so yeah, that's my talk.